Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture presented by the Hurley Heritage Society. My name is Raleigh Green, the Hurley Heritage Society, with the Hurley Heritage Society and the organizer of our lecture series. Tonight's lecture is titled Building the Old South Plantation in the Hudson River Valley, Middle Class Idylls of Service and Status, 1875 to 1900. Before we get started, a couple quick notes. First, and very importantly, I want to announce that the opening of the Hurley Heritage Society Museum for the season has been postponed by 1 week, now opening the weekend on May 9th. More on that after the lecture. Please be sure you're on mute to ensure everyone can hear the guest speaker and that there are no interruptions. During the presentation, if you have a question, you can use the chat feature to send your questions, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation, where we'll open it up for more Q&A. At the conclusion of the formal presentation, you can unmute yourselves at that time. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the Hurley Heritage Society website in the coming days. So let me now introduce you to our guest speaker, Reynolds, Rennie Scott-Childress. Some of you may know our speaker from his time as a local elected official in the city of Kingston, but he's also a respected historian who teaches history at SUNY New Paltz and the Inter-University Center in Dubrovnik, Croatia. His work focuses on the categories and practices of race and class in U.S. history. His lecture tonight, I dare say, will share some history that many of us may not be very familiar. When he and I spoke earlier this year about doing a lecture, what he shared with me about post-Civil War history in the North was frankly new to me and may be as for you as well. As such, I thought it'd be a fascinating presentation to share with all of you tonight. So without further ado, welcome Professor Rennie.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me. I look forward to speaking with you afterwards. Hopefully there's some interesting stuff that'll hold your attention for the next 30 minutes or so. All right. Members of the Nyack Country Club conjured an imaginary place on Halloween 1892. They put on a one-act play that was popular across the country called An Old Plantation Night. The variety piece depicted the supposedly happy community of enslaved people in the South before the Civil War. The well-to-do white club members pretended to be darkies. They spoke in purported Negro dialect, sang plantation melodies, and actually blackened their faces as directed in the script. The publisher's preface advised the actors not to treat the play as a crass minstrel entertainment. Rather, the play provided, quote, a sympathy for and insight into characters who were types of the Negro race. The publisher, that is, suggested that the play, though set in the past, was a psychological study of present-day black Americans in the 1890s. He failed to explain why Hudson Valley residents, such as the members of the Nyack Country Club, would find this useful. A clue can be found in a liberty the Nyack Country Club members took with the script. They introduced an extra character, Mammy, played by one of the leading lights of the club, Mrs. E.H. Maynard. This addition suggests a significant shift in American culture that has largely been unnoticed by historians. The Black Plantation Mammy is one of the most recognizable figures in American cultural symbols. Here's one of the most famous versions of this, of course, from the movie Gone with the Wind from 1939-1940 with Hattie McDaniel playing the otherwise unnamed Mammy. Throughout the 20th century, this mythical figure appeared in all manner of media as a rotund woman, black in color, wearing an apron, a kerchief covering her head. Authors used the character to extol the servant's virtues of displaying fierce loyalty to her white family, caring more for their white children than for their own quote-unquote pickaninnies, espousing rustic wisdom and bearing an aristocratic mien despite a low social status. This character lived in a large southern plantation house in the days before the Civil War. Now, numerous historians have detailed the use of the black plantation mammy stereotype as a racist icon. Others have grappled with explaining why she and her pastoral Old South plantation became wildly popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But their explanations have tended to rely on abstract claims. Mammy was a device for signifying, as one historian put it, quote, racial and cultural differences between white and black Southerners. But this observation does not explain why particular Americans would use the Old South plantation and an enslaved female servant for this purpose decades after the Civil War and in the North. Nor does it really explain anything else. Rather, this attempted explanation suggests that race is a force outside of human action that somehow shapes American consciousness. But as historian Barbara Jean Fields of Columbia University has argued, race does not explain anything. Rather, what historians must explain is why people in a specific context use race categories or symbols and not others to achieve particular ends. This talk explores how and why late 19th century residents of the Hudson River Valley, as Americans across the nation, consumed the mythological psychology of the black mammy and invented the place of the Old South plantation where they lived, way outside the South. We will see how the cultural figure of the mammy was not originally a sign of racial distinction. Rather, I will document how producers and readers of the Hudson River Valley newspapers transformed the character through the 1880s and 1890s as a way to square a deep contradiction that arose due to the increasing wealth of the expanding liberal middle class in the North. This is my basic argument throughout this paper. This is what we'll be focusing on. These Americans used the black plantation mammy stereotype in the 1890s to justify two crucial elements underpinning their class status. One was the rejection of universal equality for all people, and that was to be done in order to give them the right, quote unquote, to exploit the labor of certain groups. There were two types of mammy in 19th century U.S. culture, mothers and servants. Mammy, quote unquote, was sometimes a term of endearment for a birth mother, akin to the word mama. And indeed, if you look in a lot of British literature in this time period, mammy is the term that little kids of all types will use to refer to their mothers. The mother mammy could be a somber character or a participant in numbskull jokes. The servant mammy was a woman who served as a mother function in another woman's family. This function allowed unmarried, widowed, or childless women to fulfill the maternal role of managing a household and caring for children. Before the 1890s, neither type of mammy in Hudson River Valley newspapers and across the nation was racially marked. Mammy could be either black or white. She could be rich or poor, rustic or urban, young mother or elderly matron. In Hudson Valley newspapers before 1890, for example, mammy referred to a generic mother 29 times, to poor white mothers 21 times, and white helpers 2 times. Black mothers 0 times. Historians who have focused solely on the black plantation mammy stereotype have missed how the attributes of the early black mammies fit squarely in this a-racial servant mammy prototype. An early example, some excerpts we see here, it appears in Catherine Maria Cedric's story from 1839 called Barclay Jail. The character, known only as Mammy, is an elderly white woman devoted to the widowed, impoverished Colonel Vassall and his grandson Charles. She treats the Vassall household as her little empire. Despite her attempts to manage Charlie's manners, her devotion to him is returned in equal measure. And we can see this in a particular passage where the old family servant Mammy is cleaning the kitchen. She's thinking of herself as a privileged order of the faithful old servants. In other words, she's the one who pushes the idea of aristocracy. This alleviates the problem for Colonel Vassal, who's allowed to say, oh, I believe in total equality. I don't have to declare my class status. It's Mammy who pushes that class status. At one point, she's cleaning the kitchen, and the boy Charlie comes in with mud on his feet and his dog. And when she scolds him and whacks the dog with her broom, he says, now, Mammy, don't scold. Indeed, I forgot to scrape my feet. There now, he added, rising on his tiptoes, leaning over the old woman's shoulder, and he gives her a kiss on her widowed cheek. Now they're friends again. So this affectionate kiss is a panacea here in this particular instance. The muscles of Mammy's face relax, she softens, and she just is effusive in her love for young Charlie. So when in the story, he's falsely accused of a crime and is gone for many, many decades. But when he returns, Mammy is still there. And the first thing he does when he comes home is he gives her a big, affectionate hug. These traits, the elderly woman, the servant as the guarantor of the household aristocracy, affection between servant and master, given and received, nurse devoted to another woman's children, would later be incorporated into the Black Plantation Mammy stereotype by a legion of writers and cartoonists. But in the Civil War era, there were relatively few black mammies in all of American literature. Before 1890 in Hudson River Valley newspapers, for example, there were only 9 total, and that's after the Civil War for the most part. 4 were poor mothers, 1 was a respected patriarch, and 3 were domestic servants. They rarely comported to the later Black Plantation Mammy stereotype. Only one of these figures in the Hudson Valley newspapers fit that stereotype, and even then you have to stretch the stereotype. This lack of black plantation women was partly due to the many meanings of plantation in 19th century culture. The plantation in Hudson Valley and national newspapers was not the stereotype it later became. Throughout the 19th century, plantation meant many things. It was a place where planters naturally planted crops. It was a rural election district. It could be a grove of fruit trees. The people who populated plantations in newspaper articles and fictional stories, whether in the slave South or elsewhere, were overwhelmingly male. Moreover, for many Americans outside the South, the slave plantations symbolized 2 hated concepts: the violence of chattel slavery or the neo-aristocratic fiefdom that stood in opposition to American Republican ideals. Few Americans outside the South before the 1880s venerated the slave plantation as a feasible model for resolving ideological contradictions. Now, in this picture from a magazine from 1858, you can see that the central figure is a male figure who's doing the work of picking cotton. While there are women in the picture, they're not the center. The other crucial thing is that the picture is workers in the field, not a woman who has a kind of servant function in her mistress's household. American authors, illustrators, and editors increasingly produced images of black women through the 1880s, but they rarely matched the later black plantation mammy stereotype. Readers of Hudson Valley newspapers would no doubt be familiar with them. One type was the mammy birth mother in quote-unquote numbskull jokes or anecdotes of daily life with her children. Another was a domestic servant, sometimes on a plantation, but not fitting the stereotype. A third one, requiring some attention because often confused with the stereotype, was the forlorn, emancipated black woman. This is a famous picture. There we go. This is a famous picture from the cover of Harper's Weekly from 1875. It's the depiction of an elderly black woman in kerchief and apron, but it doesn't necessarily connote mammy as plantation servant, as historians have often said. So on the left, I've got an example of someone who's claiming that she is a perfect example of a mammy figure. And I'm going to note why she isn't that. Northern commentators sometimes used the image to express ambivalence over the outcome of the Civil War. In this cover, for example, we see the aged, portly black woman wearing the white cap and apron. That could be reminiscent of the mammy stereotype. But here she drags on her tobacco pipe while sitting on by her stove. It's not another woman's stove. She's not working for another woman. This is her house, and she's ignoring the whistling tea kettle. Careful attention reveals that she's not the stereotype. The accompanying text, which I have on the right side of the screen here, laments her solitude, the destruction of her old world, her children scattered far away. It says nothing about her working for another woman, working for a mistress in someone else's household, or even caring for children anymore. She is not nostalgic for dem good old days on the plantation. She recalls the terrors of the dreaded auction block and the driver's whip. What she wistfully remembers of antebellum life are kindred she cared for, her family. But her scattering prevents her from conceiving her post-abolition life as a boon. The old life, quote, is like a dream to her now, and often she wonders if it can indeed be true that she is free. The picture, then, is not the Black Plantation mammy caricature. It is rather a meditation on the woman's lost social place and the undermining of her mother role in the aftermath of a devastating war. This was a sentiment with which many northern white mothers of all types, black and white, who lost sons in battle, could identify. So this is the sort of thing where many northerners, 10 years or so after the war, were wondering, what was it all for? Was it really an improvement in our lives? And that is, to a great extent, what the author is trying to get across with this picture. After this, Northern liberals began to transform the uses of the black female domestic worker due to a grave crisis in American labor. While husbands of the group struggled with the recruitment and control of workers in industrial factories, their wives attacked the problem of hiring and managing domestic servants. The popular authors who advised these wives on domestic issues, however, confronted a deep ideological dilemma. On the one hand, the expanding cadre of liberal-class northern mistresses adhered to anti-caste liberalism. That is, they held a strong belief in the principle enshrined in the Declaration of Independence that all persons were created equal. Harriet Beecher Stowe and her sister Catherine Beecher, for example, asserted in their 1869 book American Woman's Home that America starts with a political organization based on a declaration of the primitive freedom and equality of all men. That's in a book that's all about how to do domestic duties. On the other hand, the growing size and complexity of mistresses' houses required more labor than what the Beecher sisters envisioned. To prove one's economic status, socioeconomic status, and to be able to take part in the practice of liberal culture, this required the hiring of live-in domestic servants. As one domestic servant author put it, if no servant, no mistress. But how could a woman profess faith in equality while simultaneously exploiting the labor of other women who would have to forego their own dreams of marriage and motherhood? One solution adopted by many domestic literature authors was to turn away from their earlier commitment to ideals of universal equality. They re-envisioned the very nature of servants to now proclaim them as members of an inferior race unfit for the responsibilities and fruits of equality. Through the 1880s, they thus sought to racialize immigrant Irish women as intellectually and physically unsuited for anything but domestic servants. Cartoonists depicted Irish women as masculine, brutish, and haughty. Here you can see the classic middle-class mistress who's basically feeling like she's being bullied by her servant. She can't do anything. It's the servant who rules the household. Hudson Valley newspapers joined in this project. One editorialist, for example, observed that social status required the hiring of, quote, a stout Irish girl, even if it meant paying her beyond the family's financial means. The Red Hook Journal ran a short story in 1869 to warn readers that Bridget, the pet name for all Irish domestic servants, was a faithless thief. Local editors made them the brunt of numerous numbskull jokes. But it was clear by the 1880s that the project of racializing the Irish had backfired. The derision of Irish women contributed to Irish mistresses' deep distrust of them. Moreover, Irish immigrants had cultural and economic resources that enabled them to escape making domestic service a yoke passed down through succeeding generations. Mistresses decided that the warfare between the kitchen and the parlor was too taxing. It was thus with great interest that they began to read and appreciate a new genre of literature produced in the nation's magazines and newspapers. Here we have to take a little detour into the production of popular culture in the Gilded Age period. Americans in the 1880s experienced a new way of conceiving their relations to one another as members of a national culture. Before the Civil War, most American magazine publishers concentrated on narrowly regional markets. After the Civil War, a new generation of magazinists created a national audience by taking advantage of the rapid expansion of railroads, new print technologies, and postal delivery efficiencies. Newspaper publishers, while they maintained their roots in local markets, also became more tied to national culture. Newspaper syndicates, for example, distributed articles, fiction, and humor simultaneously to readers across the country. Americans from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon could read the same news and fiction on the same day. Editors at the new nationally circulating magazines, some of which still exist, like Harper's and The Atlantic, but other ones like The Century and Lippincott's, took advantage of these innovations to advance a project of cultural reconstruction. Deeply concerned that no solidary American nation had arisen from the ashes of the Civil War, they developed a paradoxical strategy to enable Americans in different regions to see themselves as members of a single national people. Their idea was to recruit authors from different regions of the country to produce local color stories that exemplified their unique regional cultures. The magazine editors sought writers native to each region who could write in identifiable regional dialects, portray rustic characters unique to their cultures, and floridly describe local landscapes. This is where we get the idea of there being a South, a New England, Hoosiers in the Midwest, and a whole series of different groups of people that we think of as being very local regional cultures. But by far the most important region of the magazine editors was that of the South. Northern magazine and book publishers sponsored numerous investigations of the post-vellum South to ascertain the chances of reintegrating that region into the nation to fulfill Lincoln's mystical dream of national unity. The resulting articles and books proved quite popular. This was true, too, of literature set in the South. One crucial aspect of the South, about which Northerners were particularly curious, concerned the freed people and their potential for citizenship and economic advancement. To satisfy this curiosity, the increasing market demand, fiction writers began to make the South and the Southern quote-unquote Negro the subject of stories and novels. One variety of such fiction focused on how formerly enslaved persons might enter the modern Northern economy. For example, Jane Austen's story, not that Jane Austen, Done in Ebony, which appeared in an 1869 issue of the Rockland County Journal, told the story of an emancipated black woman named Lily White. Austen focused on Lily White's travails in slavery, particularly her cruel separation from her 13 children. Lily White, unlike the Black Plantation stereotype, Mammy, is an independent woman. The scene of the story is outside the South, and the white narrator ends up befriending Lily White. They become pals, not employer and servant. But such stories that suggested economic freedom and social integration of the formerly enslaved were soon eclipsed by the development of another character that would become widely popular throughout the nation. Now we're going to get back to the invention of the mammy in the late 19th century. The magazine and book publishers who championed cultural reconstruction increasingly framed their project as a form of realism. Authors such as the Massachusetts native Austen, they believed, could not tell the truth about either the culture of the South or the psychology of the emancipated Negro. They thus sought out Southern-born authors to tell about the region. There were three crucial distinctions between the works of these authors and those born outside the South. First, they wrote about a Southern past, where Northern authors more often wrote about the present South. Second, authors such as Mississippian Sherwood Bonner, Georgian Joel Chandler Harris, and Virginian Thomas Nelson Page made the house servant of the old plantation their central character. If they wrote about emancipated persons, it was only to extol the virtues of the antebellum Old South plantation, the mythical one. Third, they adapted crucial elements of the earlier 19th century figure of the servant mammy to a specifically black character. The two appearances of William Tappan Thompson's story, The Mysterious Box, demonstrate this transition. Thompson was born outside the South in Ohio in 1812, but he moved to Savannah, Georgia in his late 30s. He would go on to become a vocal supporter of Confederate nationhood. The 1850 version of his story, The Mysterious Box, which appeared in the Rockland County Journal, followed much of the earlier traditions of the Mammy figure. Mammy in the story is a birth mother, wife to Mr. Pepper. The domestic servant is named Fanny. She speaks standard English, bears no marks of blackness, and comports to the standard servant type delineated in Sedgwick's Berkeley Jail. But Tappan heavily revised the story when he republished it in 1872. He made Fanny a black woman who referred to Pepper now as Massa. She now spoke a Negro dialect. Yet even here the black plantation mammy stereotype was not clearly in place. Fanny is neither rotund nor bedecked with a kerchief. The scene is not a plantation. And while she speaks a little bit in dialect, it is not the heavily cacographic form that would later be crucial to the stereotype. That is, she displays neither the pretensions nor the authority of that later stereotype. Indeed, the first character fitting the stereotype published in a Hudson Valley newspaper did not appear until 1887. Aunt Chloe, in a brief, purportedly true anecdote, was an old colored mammy who did not approve of Marse John, her mistress's suitor. As in the stereotype, she feels the power of her position to candidly criticize the man who might become her master. But it was only in the 1890s that full-length portraits deploying the stereotype became frequent in Hudson Valley newspapers. The creators of these fictions fabricated a deep psychology of the black plantation mammy. Often given the generic name Dinah, she purportedly desired nothing more than to serve her master and mistress. Writers in the nationally circulating magazines asserted that Dinah, not her owners, was the true agent of aristocracy on the old plantation. She evinced a contradictory character of folk wisdom and intellectual poverty. Critics of these stories often approached them not as fictional works, but as virtual ethnologies, as if black plantation mammies and related characters were actual people. You get a sense of this on the left and the right here. The picture on the left is done in a highly realistic style. You see that the mammy in the middle there is in the middle of a conversation with her mistress and maybe the daughter of her mistress. On the right, we see a classic picture of the mammy taking care of a white child. But crucially, in the middle, even though this is something of what they would call a knucklehead story, the scene is not on a plantation. It's in a northern middle-class parlor. This is very much a servant mammy working for this northern white mistress. So readers of the Poughkeepsie Journal, Poughkeepsie Eagle News, for example, encountered just such a psychological study, quote unquote, in Will Harbin's story Aunt Clara's Intercession. Harbin, a native of Georgia, produced a classic black plantation mammy figure. Aunt Clara speaks in Negro dialect. She cares for Marse Melville, her white child, but neglects her own black children. She differentiates between the high ethical standards of the white family she serves and the poor, purportedly low morals of her own race, yet declares at the story's conclusion that the distinctions make no sense to her. By the early 1900s, the vast majority of characters referred to as Mammy in American culture were black women. From a mere handful of black women characters in Hudson Valley newspapers before 1890, there were 173 in the next 2 decades. Black women accounted for 79% of the total. Of the black women, 64% were the black plantation mammy stereotype. Blackness had become so associated with the mammy character that one commentator in the Irvington Gazette advised parents to prohibit their children from referring to mother as mammy. Quote, "For mammy has long been appropriated by the dear old colored nurses of the South as their lovable designation." End quote. It was only at this point, at the turn of the 20th century, that these Americans hardened the black plantation mammy stereotype character into a stereotype. They transformed the project of racialization of black women from the denigration applied to the Irish in the 1870s to veneration for the black plantation mammy's supposed skills. Bridget's high-handedness became Dinah's aristocratic air. Bridget's masculinity became Dinah's rotund figure. And Bridget's lack of children became Dinah's indifference to her own children. So now we can bring this back to the Nyack Country Club where we started. The well-heeled members of the Nyack Country Club had come to understand in the 1890s that, to paraphrase the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, people are good to think with. Such quote-unquote people do not have to be actual people. Sometimes invented ones are even better. Realities do not then get in the way. When Northern magazine and book publishers, Southern fiction writers, and artists and playwrights across the country made the black plantation mammy into a nationally consumed stereotype, people in the Hudson Valley like Mrs. E. H. Maynard saw her social value. They repressed their memories of the horrifying devastation of the Civil War and fabricated an idyllic Southern plantation where they could imagine warm relations between generous master and loyal servant. They transformed the earlier depiction of the humble servant mammy into the black plantation mammy in the 1890s to conjure up a vision of the ideal domestic servant and rational, prudent class distinctions. Historians have largely missed this transformation because they have been intent on seeing the black plantation mammy largely as an expression of race. They have not grappled with why particular Americans created the stereotype. And why others cottoned to it in a particular historical context. They have focused too intently on one version of the mammy and not on the historical development of the servant mammy over the whole 19th century. But through careful examination of this history, we can see that the figure of the black domestic servant does not necessarily connote the black plantation mammy stereotype. So to be a stereotype, there must be a couple of characteristics. First, there has to be a critical mass of agreement over its essential symbolic elements. If only two people think of something a particular way, that's not what I would call a stereotype. Second, there has to be a clear understanding of its social uses, and this has to be agreed upon by a large mass of people, and, related to that, there has to be clear evidence of the stereotype's wide production, and we get that. There were black plantation mammies stereotypes produced all the way from Maine to Hawaii in this time period. That play that I mentioned at the very beginning, there's a production of it in Honolulu in 1893. So, American liberals only assembled these elements into a single symbol around the turn of the 20th century. These Americans assembled these elements in the figure of the black plantation mammy stereotype at that point. They did so because they were desperate to limit the real world problems that they associated with the liberal ideal of universal equality. Liberal class Americans first used the black plantation mammy stereotype as a way of holding on to their faith in equality while justifying their desire to exploit the labor of others. But white Americans increasingly used the stereotype after 1900 to assert the quote-unquote reality of race. The black plantation mammy became one of the few black female figures produced in American popular culture, from the 1915 movie The Birth of a Nation to the 1936 novel Gone with the Wind, the 1939 movie version of it, and beyond. Early 20th century historians and social scientists, in turn, took the myth and made it real in reams of academic research in which they basically parroted the fiction stories of the 1890s from the South. Students who study this process will be able to understand how people in the past created this stereotype to do very particular things. They will also gain experience in considering how people use race in our contemporary United States. Thanks for your attention. We can have a discussion, or we can start drinking. Whatever y'all want to do. Or do both. Depends on how you're stocked.
We can do all of it. Well, that was really fascinating. A lot of information that you shared there. Um, I have some questions, but before I do, I want to let everyone know that they are welcome to unmute themselves and just jump on in and ask a question, or you can send a question through chat feature, and just type it in if you would like. Does anyone want to ask a question right now? Yes, Hildegard?
Um, Very, very interesting and never really an idea presented to me before. So I'm fascinated. But I wanted to say that all through the talk, I kept thinking of my childhood TV image of Mammy in the Beulah program.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's counted into uh, well into the decades of the 20th century. I also want to report that a woman I knew who was a student at Kingston High School in the early 1930s reported to me, and I checked in the yearbook and I saw the picture, that the drama club, which ostensibly was integrated like the school, was a club that the students of color knew was not open to them.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1932-33, the drama club put on a play in which there was a black maid. So a white student played the black maid in blackface
Mm-hmm.
for performances.
I've heard of blackface performances in New Paltz into the 1960s.
Yeah. So
I don't know if you can see it, but there's this book that just came out called Darkology. This literally just came out, and it's all about exactly what you're talking about. It's about how white folks across the nation used blackface in all kinds of local productions.
Yep. So, but this is wonderful, wonderful research. You lived in newspapers.
I did. Well, fortunately, the internet, it makes this kind of research really easy and fun to do now. It used to be that you'd have to take Dramamine and look at reams and reams of microfilm.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
There's some questions in the chat. Rennie, can you see that? There's one here that says, but why the need for such a stereotype?
So my argument is that you've got a large number of Americans, particularly in the North, in the Gilded Age, because of industrialization and the growing economic power of the United States in the world, they're realizing that the old American dreams of equality across the board were inconvenient to their desire to hire servants or inconvenient to their desire to exploit the labor of steel workers, for example. And so they're looking for a way to try to justify that. And that's why they start to glom onto this particular stereotype, because it looks like this character is somebody who they can then define as being members of a race that's so different from them that they don't have to extend the values of independence and freedom to those folks. And moreover, there's excuse me, there's stories that actually go into the psychology, the purported psychology of these servants, to the point where they're saying these servants, all they want to do is take care of other women's children. And it's quite striking. There's one by a woman named Grace King, an author from New Orleans, called Little Mammy. And it's all about a woman, an elderly mammy woman after the Civil War who's forlorn because all of her quote unquote children have been taken away from her. But now she finds a village where they don't have any servants and she's able to take care of the children, the white children, and that fulfills her supposed reason for being. So that's what they're doing. They're creating the stereotype as a way of allowing themselves to both believe in equality in certain circumstances, but it allows them then to not extend it to certain people so they can exploit their labor. I hope that answers your question.
Well, Deborah, um, um, Deborah Scroy asked that question. I'd like to ask, um, this may be, oh, what's the Aunt Jemima brand, which was discontinued, I think in 2021, an extension and transformation of the Mammy concept?
Absolutely. So the Aunt Jemima brand came into being in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair. The brand had been around for a while, but it was only then that they hit on the idea of they actually hired an actual black woman named Nancy Green, and they set up a grill at the Chicago World's Fair where they were making pancakes and selling the syrup. And so it's her literal face from 1893 into the early 20th century that is that's depicted on that for that brand. And so it's directly out of this. And so that's another way of it becomes a kind of racial masking, because the pancake mix that they made would have been made in factories by white workers, but the dream is that the white mistress's kitchen work is made easier because you have this ersatz black servant who's put the powder in the box, and all you do is add water and pour syrup on it after you cook it. So yeah, that's exactly a part of this whole story.
Uh, I just got to follow up on that. Does this stereo, don't mean to put you in a spot, but does this stereotype still exist? Has it just been perhaps repackaged in a new form?
There have been certainly new extensions of it, and certainly in white supremacist literature of the current day, you can find elements of this. But I think I would say that there's a newer stereotype about black women. That's the angry black woman, as opposed to the mammy servant type. So I don't think the mammy servant type is as extent. It's certainly not like it was into the 1960s. So, for example, as you pointed out, the company that makes the Aunt Jemima products, they tried for a while to put her in a business suit to sort of suggest she's a busy businesswoman, and that's why she uses these products, because they make her life easier while she's at work and taking care of her own children. But they eventually had to give up on that because it was still too offensive.
Um, One of the questions kind of bring to Hurley. Did Hurley households have servants? Um, and they uh, uh, follow up that I believe that Hurley was a farming community and not particularly wealthy. Can you speak to that?
So I don't know specifically how many servants there may have been in Hurley per se, but the crucial thing is that not all uh, not all northern households could afford to hire live-in servants. Some couldn't even afford to hire part-time servants. But the dream lived on. That's the important thing. So the people who might not be wealthy enough to hire a servant could still believe that one day they'll get there, and there's this dream then that they have that the perfect household is the one in which there is a live-in servant who's a woman of color. There's a famous New Yorker cover from the mid 1940s, late 1940s, of The American Dream, and it shows a white man and a white woman with a new baby, and they're standing on a cloud, but kind of above them, just out of reach, is the house, the perfect house with the white picket fence, and there's a black maid who's come out the door. So it's a wider dream than just being able to actually hire somebody. Now, this also then actually changed the way that Americans live and where they live, because into the early 20th century, there were actually very few black Americans who lived in the North. New York City, for example, less than 2% of New York City residents were people of color. Same in places like Chicago. Most of the North had very few black residents per capita. But because of the popularity of this image, a whole series of employment agencies sprung up in which they would go down south and recruit black women to move north specifically to become servants in other people's households. So that was the beginning. World War I, of course, is the time period when there's a massive immigration of black Southerners out of the South to parts of the North to take the jobs that the white men were leaving behind to go fight the war. But this, that's the thing. The dream came first. The dream of black service came first, and then actual black women doing the service work followed in the wake of the dream.
You're saying that the the construct, the creation of this servant mammy concept actually inspired the migration north?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. hmm and I see there's a question here about eugenics. Yes. So in this particular presentation, I didn't want to go into all the quotations and evidence that I have about how historians and sociologists and other scientists, even the pseudoscientists like the eugenicists, when you read their work, it's shocking how it tracks with the fiction stories that I've been talking about. They're not doing actual research, or they do actual research, but they interpret it all through this lens of the black plantation mammy stereotype. It's quite shocking, even to the point where the famous early sociologist Robert Park, in a famous passage they used the term Negro. He said the Negro is the woman of the races, of all the races of the world. And so this image of the black plantation mammy stereotype was so powerful that he just read all black people as that. There's also the black sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois in the early 20th century lamented that black Americans had become so associated with the concept of service that it was very difficult for them to break into other fields of economic endeavor. So, but also eugenics was after 1900. So again, they're picking up on these stereotypes and then trying to make them into reality through their pseudoscience. And I see where did the stereotype come from? Then admin, newspapers, authors. Yes. So the there's a much longer element to this because one of the first things that actually happened, one of the first ways that people in the North began to shift away from their thinking about integrating the formerly enslaved as equals in American society was through the popularity and the invention of a new type of, a new genre of music called it would later be called the spirituals, but it was called Jubilee. And the first group to do this in 1872 was a group of students, black students from the Freedmen's University in Nashville, Tennessee, named Fisk. And Fisk needed money, and so they organized a singing group, and they were going to tour the North to raise money by singing and having concerts. The songs that they sang at first were popular songs, theater songs, songs that anybody in the country sang. And every once in a while, early on, they would throw in a song that they said was from the old plantation. And their audiences began to get really excited by these songs. So the Jubilee singers began to put more and more of these songs into their performances. That led to a whole series of people creating these kind of groups, singing, creating the Jubilee singing, and pretending to be Southern. So like there was a group that was called the Alabama Jubilee Singers. It was made up of people from Philadelphia. So this was the first kind of move where a lot of people saw this as real. They saw this singing as real Southern plantation culture, even though it was actually something that was created after the Civil War to a great extent. There was then a whole series of associations that these Northern magazine editors picked up on, and they began looking for people from the South that they believed could write about Southern culture, and that's where the stereotype takes its first legs in the 1880s and into the 1890s.
There's another question I see. Where were there other stereotypes of black women discussed besides Mammy, such as Jezebel and Sapphire?
Certainly there were elements of these, but throughout the 19th century, most of the, in terms of popular culture, when we talk about the sexuality of black Americans, it was much more a fear of black men's sexuality and less about black women as being these kind of stereotypes of the Jezebel and the Sapphire. But there's also clearly an element here where the black plantation mammy is figured as an elderly woman, a portly woman, a woman who's already got children, somebody who's not physically attractive. All of these things were meant to kind of set her off and away from being sexually alluring. So there's a clearer element in thinking through with the stereotype these concerns about having young women in the household. Of course, there was much more about Irish women in the middle part of the 19th century into the late 19th century, about them being alluring to the masters of the households. So these stereotypes are definitely around, but I think that they became much more prominent after 1900. That gets into a whole issue about the change in the minstrel theater program, and that's where Jezebel and Sapphire become much more popular.
Any other questions? This is the time to ask.
Well,
All
okay.
right. Robert,
Yeah, Robert will do. But anyway, Reynolds, well, first I have to say this was fascinating. And the subject matter. I mean, I would, I'm really surprised. I mean, I guess my question would be, whatever made you get so deeply involved and research so much about this particular subject? And I found it totally fascinating. It's, but I was just curious, what was driving you to really suss this out?
I'll give you a quick version. I'm originally from North Carolina. I was among the first children in the country to be bused to achieve racial integration in 1968. And so, in a sense, this has been my entire life. So I was part of this huge social experiment. I then went to college in New York City, and was so poor I couldn't leave. And so I ended up working in publishing. And so I had a real clear understanding of what goes into the production of a book and a magazine. So when I finally decided to go to graduate school, it was because I had discovered by accident a story called Mars Chan, which is right out of this tradition. It's by a white Virginia author. It's from 1884, and it's all told in this quote unquote Negro dialect. And it's about so it's narrated by this former slave who's giving this history of the South before the Civil War. And he's saying about how wonderful it was. He was great friends with his master until that ugly Civil War came, and that destroyed the whole future of the Confederacy and this guy's life. And I was thinking, this is just bizarre. And so that's what got me going. And so my work earlier was about the publishers who put this stuff out. And so the work now is moving into why it is that it was popular with audiences.
Wow. Okay. Well, just one other thing that's, somebody in the group here mentioned Beulah, the back from, I guess, the late 50s, the television show. And, I'm part of the TV generation, also baby boomer deal. But, and I used to watch it when we got a black and white television. There wasn't a lot of entertaining stuff. And that was actually one of the shows that I enjoyed watching as a 6 or 7-year-old. But it seemed to me that the way they portrayed her, she was actually the one that always kind of knew what was going on and was the one that, kept the ship on a study course, and everybody else was, a little flaky. But so, and I guess the other thing it brought up was thinking of shows like, not about Mammy, but like Jack Benny, who had his black servant, and that transition where, I guess that whole evolution from what I'm getting from your talk here is how he's kind of evolving out of this stereotype vision that we have. But all right, no, just a personal anecdote.
Yeah. Well, no, I need to watch Beulah then.
Well,
Unfortunately.
I probably saw it when I was 5 or 6 years old, but and so I'm kind of reaching back, but that is the impression that's kind of left with me.
Thank you for that reference.
Hildegard?
Do you think that there is any relationship or any connection at all between this phenomenon that you describe post the Civil War to what the sociologists of feminism have named the cult of domesticity, which was the expectation for the white woman to maintain the hearth at home while the husband was out in this new industrial society making money for the family, and her place was in the home.
There's a clear relation to the extent that Americans very clearly segregated the roles of men and women in the household throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. So there's a very clear relationship, but a crucial difference here between the people who talk about the cult of domesticity. The originators of that concept were trying to demonstrate that women were weak, were extremely limited in their lives, had no power whatsoever, were in a sense duped by religion and culture. But the other source besides the newspapers that I focus on is these domestic advisors. So the Beecher sisters, for example, and other women of that ilk were writing, these are like, they would have recipes. They would talk about the best way to polish the furniture, while they're also saying, you've got to be free and equal. So this is a kind of different there's a sense that these women have greater strength than the sociologists and historians who talk about the cult of domesticity. There's also a clear sense in which there's a language in which these domestic advisors are saying, this is the same thing as politics. This is the same thing as the labor issue, but it's in the home. And so they were breaking down to a great extent that division that the historians and sociologists of the cult of domesticity said was just there was a huge gulf between them. But here, there's not that same gulf. There's clear difference in roles. And I would never say that women have the same amount of political power or economic power as the men or the husbands. But there's a very different sense of what the woman's role was within that box than from earlier in the century. Does that
Thank
answer your question?
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, don't see any more questions, and we've kind of hit our time. But I do want to say to you, Professor Rennie, that was one of the most interesting lectures I've attended in a long time. And I want to thank you so much for your time and sharing
Oh,
it
I'm
with
sure you say that to all the presenters.
us. No, but your time and giving to the Hurley Heritage Society and the community is greatly appreciated.
My pleasure.
I'm going to finish the evening by just thanking everyone for coming out to this wonderful presentation. Don't forget that the Hurley Heritage Society Museum is opening for the 2026 season on May 9th, Saturday and Sunday, May 9th and 10th from 1 to 4 p.m. And we'll be unveiling our new exhibit, Hurley in the Revolution. Hurley happened here, or excuse me, history happened here, telling the stories of Hurley residents during the Revolutionary War years. Also on opening day, Saturday, May 9th, Gina Martin and Aaron Van Holt will be demonstrating linen and wool spinning. There'll also be some other fascinating exhibits, especially those for children. For the evening, thank you so much and have a great night.
All right. Good night, all.
Good night.